Now that my Resident Evil retrospectives are all in the books, for the time being at least, this Halloween I want to move on to a new franchise of survival horror games that left a lasting impression on me. This is Dead Space. Unlike the long-running Resident Evil series that I initially had a non-existent relationship with, Dead Space was one I was heavily involved in from the moment it was conceived in 2008. I kept up with each new release that followed in what would make up a trilogy of games on the PlayStation 3. Dead Space is set in the 26th century, centering around protagonist Isaac Clarke, a starship engineer that gets pitted against hordes of undead mutant humanoids called necromorphs, and disposes of them using a vast array of futuristic weaponry. In the first two games, he explores claustrophobic environments within starships and space stations, and in the third one, even traverses an entire planet. Dead Space leans into more science fiction concepts, and its dark cosmic atmosphere is reminiscent of the Alien films, particularly that more intimate first one, making the player feel isolated and all alone. The thought that there is no help coming, and that no one can hear screams within the vacuum of space. The cover of the original game is iconic and encompasses all these ideas brilliantly, with a disembodied arm floating lifelessly among other debris. The OG Dead Space, developed by Redwood Shores' later Visceral Games, holds up incredibly well after all these years. I had beaten it about 4 or 5 times since it came out, on various difficulty levels. My last save for the game was from early 2013, before the release of Dead Space 3, so it had been over a decade since I played through the story last. Some of the puzzles had me scratching my head all over again. Many of the creature designs I came across were as unsettling as they were the first time I laid eyes on them, and almost all of the jump scares genuinely frightened me, because I forgot when and where each one popped up. I found God a few times. Let's just leave it at that. The first Dead Space takes place in the year 2508. Humanity is on the verge of extinction due to a lack of valuable resources left on planet Earth. The surviving humans decide to venture out into the final frontier, using mining ships called planet crackers to find more resources and bring them back home. The oldest, largest, and most successful of the planet crackers is the USG Ishimura, which has been sending out a distress signal from the remote planet of Aegis 7, where it had been performing an illegal mining operation. Aboard a shuttle named the USG Kellyan, a maintenance crew consisting of Isaac, technologist Kendra Daniels, and security officer Zach Hammond are sent in to investigate the planet-cracking vessel. Communication from the Kellyan goes mysteriously unheard by the larger Ishimura, and a floating piece of space debris strikes the shuttle, causing its docking and autopilot to malfunction, and the ship crash lands within the Ishimura. Immediately, once they set foot on the ship, it becomes clear that something terrible has happened here. The Ishimura has been seemingly abandoned for reasons unknown. The Kellyan crew would come under attack by strange monsters, humans infected with some alien virus, with only Clarke, Daniels, and Hammond surviving the assault. Isaac would be sent to explore the Ishimura in the hopes of finding parts they can use to repair the Kellyan, but that too comes under attack by necromorphs and explodes, trapping them indefinitely on the Ishimura. I can't do the level of atmosphere in this game justice, it's simply amazing. While Dead Space 1 isn't my favorite of the series, that's Dead Space 2 with all the gameplay enhancements it made. I think DS1's story and atmosphere is the strongest these games ever had. The spaceship you walk around in is just plain eerie. You can always hear monster groans and roars in your vicinity. There are sounds of falling pipes and air ducts breaking. Even when out of combat, you feel petrified, and the world around you feels so alive, like it's breathing. I think not having Isaac talk in this one makes everything more immersive too, like you're in his shoes, and if you'd humor me, it allows the Ishimura to speak to you instead, which I think is much scarier. Dead Space was, and still is, fairly unique with how it ingeniously incorporates the heads-up display into the protective suit of the main character, so as not to clutter the screen and pull you out of the experience. Isaac's resource integration gear, or rig for short, visible on his back, shows you everything you need to know about his life signs at any given time. The amount of health he has runs up his spine, and the module for his stasis energy that allows him to slow down enemies or throw and move objects using telekinesis is located on his right shoulder blade. In zero-gravity sections within a vacuum, you also see a countdown timer which indicates how much oxygen he has left. Some of the tensest moments in Dead Space occur in these no-oxygen environments. It's when the survival aspect in these games is at its strongest, cranked up to 11. The best survival horror games involve the player managing their resources, things like health, ammunition, and inventory, but Dead Space takes it a step further and has the environment around you become a hazard at times. You can get so caught up in the action, puzzles you need to solve with stasis, or enemies popping out and attacking you, that you can lose track of Isaac's suit readings if you aren't careful. Health can be replenished using one of 3 sizes of medpack by simply pressing a face button, but you can also refill it as well as stasis and oxygen using the necessary items for them in your inventory, which doesn't pause the game, by the way. Keep that in mind during combat. Stasis and oxygen levels can also be restored by finding recharge stations scattered throughout the ship, and when you're out of resources, especially oxygen in a vacuum, a race to find one of these can be nerve-wracking, because it's literally life or death. The resource management in Dead Space is a lot of fun. I wouldn't say it's as difficult as survival horror games like Resident Evil can be, though. At least not in the standard difficulty setting. You frequently have access to a shop that acts as the merchant and inventory box from Resident Evil, all conveniently rolled into one. You can purchase any health or ammo you require if you haven't been able to track down enough yourself. You can sell any extra resources you have, or treasures you have found, and also bank any for later use if you want. New suit schematics you locate can be used to increase Isaac's armor and inventory capacity, and his rig and weapons can all be upgraded using valuable power nodes at workbenches. I say Dead Space is easier than Resident Evil on a base level, but that of course depends on which Resident Evil you are looking at. Dead Space can still be quite challenging on the harder difficulties, because you have to rely mostly on the shop for resources, and spending money restricts your ability to buy the better suits and weapons, making the game tougher and tougher the farther you get into it, and with lower oxygen levels, that means you can't fuck around as much in the vacuum sequences. You have to get in and get out as quickly as possible. The over-the-shoulder gunplay in Dead Space is great, and clearly it took inspiration, like many games of the time did, from Resident Evil 4, that had come out only a few short years prior. That said, it's not a bad thing, and Dead Space found a way to set its shooting mechanics apart from its contemporaries, and even to this day, still remains one of the series' more enjoyable elements. It focuses entirely on cutting off the limbs of the necromorphs. Shooting their bodies and even heads doesn't really hurt them, at least not as much. There's a sequence to take out each one, a precise step-by-step dissection, taking an arm off here, a leg there, and following it up with a few shots to their bodies or a direct one to their neck as they crawl around, severing their head from their torso. Lining up shots can be tricky sometimes in this game, because the environments can get really dark and the blue aiming beam doesn't stand out as much as it should from the glow of the flashlight. When the camera gets all shaky when you're being dragged around by a grab arm, for example, aiming can be even more strenuous and annoying. I have the same problems with throwing projectiles sometimes too. Even after all these years, the game can be very picky with the aiming, so take as much time as you can lining up your shots. The necromorphs in Dead Space can be really fucking aggressive, charging at you and leaping before striking and grabbing you. The main ones slash at Isaac with their bladed arms, but you've got others like the leapers that crawl over walls and look like humanoid scorpions with sharp tails. Pregnant necromorphs are fat ones that break open and release smaller creatures that crawl over you and drain your health within seconds if you get too close. You've got exploders that strike you with yellow sacks attached to their arms, filled with an explosive substance. Best to take these ones out from a distance. Lurkers are these little rotund assholes that jump around and crawl all over the place. They disperse 3 tentacles out of their backs that fire sharp little spears. They are pretty easy to kill. You can take out all of their tentacles in one fell swoop. Lurkers are the result of babies undergoing the necromorph transformation, which is unfortunate. Dividers are tall and slender necromorphs that mainly walk towards you, but are harder to hit with stasis and gunfire because their limbs are so skinny. As their name would suggest, they break apart when they die into smaller octopus-looking things. Brutes are the larger bastards that run at you like rhinoceroses. They have protective growths on their bodies. Freezing them with stasis and then attacking them from behind does the most damage. Twitchers are quite interesting. They are the result of a necromorph infecting someone with a built-in stasis module in their suit, fusing it and its abilities into the new tissue created, allowing the monster to move faster and more erratically. The sole purpose of the bat-like infectors is to turn living or deceased human corpses into necromorphs that spring back to life. The Guardians, they're just plain disgusting. A mass of flesh stuck to a wall that screams and moans when you get near it. They can only be killed by severing all of the tentacles that come out of it and attach to the wall behind it. They will constantly regrow themselves, so you have to be quick. Dispatching all of these ungodly abominations is a literal blast, with the variety of weapons Isaac has at his disposal. The list isn't that extensive, a total of 7 you can unlock, with the ability to assign 4 of them at once, but all of them, minus the flamethrower really, that I never use, serve a purpose and have their own unique charm. I should mention that each one has an alternate firing mode as well, but that too I rarely find myself using. The primary firing modes are more than effective alone. The pulse rifle is a rapid-fire assault rifle that I use to dispatch the smaller creepy crawlies and fast-moving enemies. The Ripper is fucking awesome. It releases a spinning saw blade that you can use to slice and dice any enemies that dare go near it. The contact beam is a powerful single beam of energy that you can charge up for increased damage. The force gun is like a shotgun that fires a quick, short-range blast that pushes enemies backwards. The line gun is one of my favorites. It fires a horizontal beam that can be widened with upgrades, one of the most useful when trying to cut off the limbs of necromorphs, but it does fire fairly slowly until you get enough upgrades for it. And of course, we have the starting weapon, the legendary plasma cutter. Fully upgraded, this gun is by far the best in this game, and the best in the entire series, among the default weapons at least. I'll explain later. Its firing speed, ammo capacity, horizontal and vertical shooting modes, every aspect of it is well balanced, highly functional, and it may be one of the greatest weapons in video game history, in all honesty, as perfect and fun to use as can be. The USG Ishimura is broken up into several decks, all connected through a monorail system you ride in between each chapter of the story, some of which you revisit multiple times. After the destruction of the Kellyan, Isaac's goal is to locate the captain of the Ishimura, named Benjamin Matthias, to acquire his rig codes so you can access the higher security parts of the ship. Isaac finds the captain dead and is forced to take out the enhanced necromorph that is created from his corpse. You then reach the medical deck that has been barricaded by survivors. Very few of them you come across throughout the story. Most die from wounds they've suffered shortly after you approach them, are seen endlessly screaming or crying, having lost their minds, or decide to take their own life to end their waking nightmare. In Chapter 4, as you've been desperately searching for a way to get yourself, Daniels, and Hammond off the Ishimura, you have to activate the ship's asteroid defense system to keep it in one piece during a meteor shower. You have to manually pilot an asteroid cannon until Hammond can restore its automated tracking system. This is one of the most frustrating parts of the game for a lot of players. The controls are very awkward. You steer the cannon with the right analog stick and fire with R1, which goes against all of your shooter sensibilities a bit. The game only lets you fuck up a few times too, so your accuracy needs to be pinpoint. I think a lot of people exaggerate the difficulty of the cannon sequence though. It's not as bad as it's made out to be. There is that achievement that has you keep the ship's shield above 50% throughout the entire section, which admittingly is tougher than frozen dog shit. But does anyone even hunt for those things anymore? Achievements? To be honest, I actually think the spacewalk leading up to the cannon is worse than the cannon itself. It's just overly long and kinda boring. All you do is hide behind these box things to avoid the falling asteroids. It feels like an eternity to get through it, at least when you make your way back after the cannon's tracking system has been initiated. You fight a bunch of leapers to keep you busy. You would come to learn that the hydroponics deck, which houses an internal farm that grows food for the workers aboard the Ishimura, has been infected by a large creature Isaac must poison and kill. The air there has also been polluted by necromorphs called Weezers, with disgusting sac-like growths on their backs. You take out all the Weezers, but the poison you create isn't enough to kill the larger Leviathan creature, and Isaac is forced to finish it off by himself in zero gravity. The Leviathan is an ugly mass of flesh with large tendrils. It spits these toxic boulders out of its mouth that you can throw back for damage. Choke on them, motherfucker! As you explore more of the Ishimura, you come to realize what has been causing this necromorph infestation. The mining the ship had been doing on Aegis 7 uncovered an alien obelisk called the Marker that emits powerful electromagnetic signals that cause dementia and psychosis within anyone that comes in contact with it. This marker, labeled Marker 3A, is actually an artificially created clone through reverse engineering that the original version, found several hundred years ago on Earth, had influenced the human race to fabricate, making them believe it would lead them to a bountiful source of energy, when in reality it just spreads the information required to make more markers and in turn more necromorphs across the cosmos. That's its true purpose. The extraterrestrial manipulation of the initial marker would give rise to a religion, a cult within humanity, called Unitology, that had funded the mining colony on Aegis 7, searching for the red marker. Unitologists believe that the symbols on the marker are a message that reveal the true meaning of human life, that humans will achieve immortality through rebirth after death, that the marker's knowledge will unite all of us into one body, one mind, and one voice, allowing humanity to transcend spiritually in an event called Convergence. More on that in my reviews of Dead Space 2 and 3. While Isaac is tracking down and mixing the poison components to kill the Leviathan, he battles a monstrous creation of one Dr. Chalice Mercer, a scientist on the Ishimura and member of Unitology who became obsessed with the necromorphs and worships them like gods. Mercer views them as the future of the human species, that it's our destiny to evolve into them. He even ends up sacrificing himself to an infector in order to turn into one of them. That's nasty. Dr. Mercer had experimented on one of the miners who found the red marker named Brant Harris and implanted a piece of necromorph tissue directly into his brain in an attempt to unlock the marker's knowledge. This caused Harris's body and mind to break apart and undergo a unique transformation, turning him into the Hunter. The Hunter is kind of like the Tyrants, Mr. X and Nemesis from Resident Evil, in that it never seems to want to fucking die. It has the ability to regenerate any lost arms or legs you shoot off of it, which is why once you leave it a limbless torso on the ground, you'll want to hit it with stasis to slow the regeneration down, proceeding to run like the wind in the opposite direction. In Chapter 5, you defeat it by trapping it in a freezing chamber and having it shipped off to some dark, obscure corner of the Ishimura, but it returns in Chapter 10, hot on your tail, while you have to solve a puzzle of sliding walls to create a clear path to escape. It's the most nail-biting part of this entire game in my opinion. Makes me want to shit my pants from the anxiety. I can't think straight. When you finally get to melt the Hunter down to viscous goo with the exhaust of a space shuttle, it's extremely satisfying. You want to jump up and down and take a piss on its remains. Isaac would be sent to the mining deck to place a distress beacon on an asteroid housed there, before releasing it back into the unknown. A ship called the USM Valor, part of the Earth Defense Force, Earth's collective military, would respond to the SOS. The Valor's comms officer would tell Isaac and Kendra that they had located one of the Ishimura's escape pods, one that had been released earlier in the game by Hammond that unfortunately contained a trapped necromorph. The creature violently attacks all of the Marines aboard, kills the pilot, and the ship loses control, crashing into the Ishimura. Isaac would search the remains of the Valor for a singularity core to help power an executive shuttle found on the Ishimura by Hammond. Sadly, Hammond would meet his end on the Valor, being mauled to death by a brute. Isaac is able to survive the encounter with the brute and escape the Valor before it explodes. Isaac brings the Singularity Core to the shuttle, where he rendezvous with the Ishimura's chief science officer named Terrence Kyne. Dr. Kyne had been a member of the Church of Unitology, much like Dr. Mercer. However, when he discovered the horrific nature behind the fall of the colony on Aegis 7 after they had located the marker, and his warnings of bringing it onto the ship fell on deaf ears, he renounced the Church. Just like the rest of the crew on the Ishimura, though, Kyne succumbed to the psychological delusions created by the alien obelisk. He would hear the voice of his deceased wife Amelia, and would eventually start speaking to her as if she was standing right next to him. Amelia told her husband to return the marker to its pedestal on Aegis 7. It was the only way the necromorphs could be stopped and their hive mind neutralized. Isaac would team up with Dr. Kyne to achieve this. You locate the red marker and transport it onto the executive shuttle to be taken back to the planet's surface. When you return to Kyne near the shuttle, he is shot and killed by Kendra, who reveals herself to be an agent of the Earth government. During the early hours of the game, Kendra had been critical towards Hammond and made you believe he was the one hiding something, a classic red herring move. But it was Kendra who was the shady one. I think the twist is pretty effective and holds up rather well. EarthGov had wanted to retrieve the marker. Aegis 7 had been one big experiment orchestrated by them. The hive mind had been created due to the activation of the red marker on the planet. EarthGov intends to seal off the entire system. Logs you can find also state that the USG Valor had been sent in to destroy all traces of the Ishimura. So much like Umbrella in those earlier Resident Evil games, EarthGov looks to sweep everything they've done under the rug. Poor Isaac has had a rough time on the Ishimura. Things would only get worse for him, though. His girlfriend, Nicole Brennan, a senior medical officer on the ship, had sent him a recorded message saying things were falling apart there. She apologized for what had happened between them, wished she could talk to him, and said that she still loves him. Throughout this story, Isaac searches the Ishimura for Nicole and comes across her several times. She helps Isaac at the mining key on the mining deck, with you defending her from waves of necromorphs as she unlocks a door. Later, she helps you recall the executive shuttle housing the marker that Kendra had commandeered. Chapter 12, the final one of the game and my personal favorite, functions like a glorified escort mission, the best and most engaging in any video game I've played. You have Nicole speaking to you in the background, and while it can't be destroyed, you are essentially tasked with protecting the marker, carrying it with stasis back to its pedestal while fighting various necromorphs along the way. The focus you have on the artifact the entire time, how you flip from it to the necromorphs in combat and then back to the marker, makes for a very up-close and intimate experience. Escort missions typically involve other living, breathing characters, and not inanimate objects. But that's the thing, the marker feels alive. The fact that it's the cause behind all of this evil, all these psychological disturbances, it is a character in and of itself, one you grow closer and closer with as the game progresses. Isaac manages to overcome the odds and bring the red marker home, much like Isaac from the Bible that was meant to be sacrificed, but saved by God for doing good and believing in him. Isaac is saved as well, rewarded for his efforts. Nicole appears next to the marker, thanks him for everything, and declares them whole once again. Kendra would trap Isaac and steal back the marker, revealing that Isaac, much like Dr. Kyne, had been suffering from dementia. He had been seeing hallucinations of Nicole that the marker had created, tricking him into bringing it to the necromorph hive mind. Isaac had also been refusing to watch the rest of the recorded message from Nicole and accept her true fate. To avoid being turned into a necromorph, she had ended her own life through lethal injection. Her body was never recovered, but you wonder if possibly one of the necromorphs you killed throughout your journey on the Ishimura had been her. I know she killed herself, but this infecting organism reanimates corpses after all. You see it happen. I doubt Nicole's body would be any different. Anywho, the necromorph hive mind is awoken and takes its initial anger out on Kendra. She gets squashed by one of its tendrils and then hurled at a nearby wall. Hearing her life signs go dark is very cathartic. Am I a monster for thinking that?
Oh my god!
The boss fight against the hive mind to close off the story is great and highly memorable. I love its design, this massive worm-like monstrosity, a nexus organism consisting of God knows how many necromorph bodies. Its full length is undetermined because it had been hiding inside the core of the planet. It's got tentacles, teeth, and this nasty ribcage on its exterior that covers and protects its more tender bits. After Isaac defeats it, he flees Aegis 7 on Kendra's ship, and a large portion of the unstable planet that had been removed and had its gravity tethers destroyed by the energy of the marker crash lands, destroying the planet and the red marker along with it. As the shuttle carrying Isaac drifts through space, he finally has time for a breather and removes his helmet. His rest doesn't last long as he is attacked by another, more violent hallucination of Nicole as the screen fades to white and the credits roll. I can't put into words how much fun I had revisiting Dead Space. The original is one of my all-time favorite video games, and I think it's sacrilegious that it took me over 10 years to play it again. But I knew at some point I was going to cover it on my channel, so I just had to bide my time and wait. I'm glad I did. The game has aged like fine wine. While I don't consider Dead Space 1 to be the best in the series from a gameplay perspective, it does remain the scariest and most atmospheric in my opinion. I think its story may be the most interesting and focused of the games as well, though as I am recording this, I have yet to rebeat Dead Space 2 and 3, so my thoughts on that may change. I've only played the third one once since it came out in 2013. I remember it being pretty bland and disappointing, so the only real competition Dead Space 1 has story-wise would be from its direct sequel most likely. But who knows, maybe after all this time and with a new set of eyes, Dead Space 3 may be better than I remember. Here's hoping. I guess I should quickly mention that there is a remake of Dead Space that was released earlier this year by EA's Motive Studio. As much fun as the game probably is, I don't have any interest in playing it whatsoever. I don't think enough console generations have passed to warrant a remake of Dead Space. The changes it makes in terms of graphics and gameplay look very trivial. The original is good as is. I wish there was a more conscious effort from publishers to preserve older games in their original forms, instead of an over-reliance on remakes like this that don't change enough to feel like a completely different experience. While I consider the original Dead Space to be the scariest and most atmospheric of the series, my personal favorite would have to be Dead Space 2 from 2011. Not only did I find its enhancements to the core gameplay to be varied and imaginative, but how it built upon the rich lore established in the first game was also gripping. Whenever I play it, I find myself unable to put it down. Like any good sequel, it feels familiar, yet fresh at the same time. Dead Space 1 was very tight and claustrophobic. It took place primarily on a mining ship, the USG Ishimura. The main character, Isaac Clarke, was a silent protagonist, which made everything feel more personal and gave the spooky environment in the game more of an opportunity to speak to the player instead. Dead Space 2 was made far more expansive. Its setting is Sprawl, a massive space station built by the Earth government on the remains of Saturn's moon, Titan. It does feel a bit less intimate than the first game did. Dead Space 2 also places more of a focus on action, with larger and more dynamic set pieces than any of the ones you experienced in the original. It's got a lot more energy to it, faster pacing, but this isn't a detriment to the game. Dead Space 2 balances its action with horror brilliantly. Its change in direction and shift in genre is reminiscent of the film Aliens from 1986. Just like Aliens, Dead Space 2 is a natural continuation of what had come before. The hero has already been introduced to the evil monsters they're forced to go up against, and knows where they stand against them. They may have been pinned to a wall and taken off guard initially, but with time and knowledge, they have the necessary skills and mindset to fight back, bigger and stronger than ever. This vigor injected into the narrative makes sense with these kinds of continuing stories, because it reflects the main character's growing outlook on the situation at hand. Visceral Games made the decision to give Isaac a voice this time around, provided by Gunnar Wright. Some fans of the series were divided on this when it was first announced. While I find Isaac's muteness to be effective in Dead Space 1, I'd be the first to admit that it needed to change in further installments. You can suspend your disbelief in the original. I think the world of the Ishimura is so engrossing that Isaac talking or not doesn't really matter, but maintaining that kind of approach would be damn near impossible without a story reason behind it moving forward. Giving Isaac a voice was great. It allowed him to interact with the other characters he came across in this survival situation more realistically, and he could show much more of his personality too, which is always ideal.
The Ishimura. If the gravity tethers are still functional, I can...
You can snag off Sec and drag it back? Isaac, this is ridiculous.
If I can line the tracks up just for a few seconds, you should be able to get the transport across. Stay ready! And take care of Strauss.
Isaac, no! This is a really bad idea.
I'll stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
Yours is the last body we need to be reborn. The Makers must be absorbed.
The Makers? You mean me? But Strauss said we could destroy the marker.
Not if we consume you first.
God damn it, I trusted you! Fuck you! And fuck your marker!
Traversal and combat in Dead Space 2 remains more or less the same from what was introduced in the original. There were some tweaks made to the controls though. They've been made a bit more intuitive. Square reloads your weapon now instead of heal, and you don't have to be aiming to reload either. Refilling stasis is done by pressing triangle, and firing stasis while aiming is performed using the same button, which makes a lot more sense. Healing is now the circle button, so all of your important actions that ensure your survival are all assigned to the standard face buttons, all in close proximity to one another. There are more creative uses of stasis in Dead Space 2, moving obstacles, lowering bridges, throwing objects or nearby corpses into explosive security beams to deactivate them. Sometimes you will need to complete this little hacking minigame to search for and rewire connections to open doors or turn on elevators, which are pretty fun. There are several brief crawling sections that have you moving through vents. You'll never be attacked inside them, but they provide an interesting perspective. It's eerie hearing voices or creature sounds nearby, not knowing what awaits you on the other side. Because a lot of these areas are a bit larger and more intricate in Dead Space 2, the developers gave you a way to cycle your guidance system to pinpoint the closest save station, store, and bench on top of the primary objective, which is incredibly helpful. I think the most notable change Dead Space 2 makes to its gameplay, though, would have to be the zero-gravity sequences. They have been greatly expanded. Isaac can now hover using his suit's boosters and fly freely in any direction. L2 makes you go faster, and R2 resets his position, levels him out in case your equilibrium gets all out of whack, which it will, believe me. Solving puzzles becomes a lot more enjoyable in zero gravity, having you articulate and position yourself in certain spots. Avoiding hazards is also satisfying and challenging, because your depth perception might not be as accurate as you think it is in these disorienting, weightless environments. Factor in you juggling your oxygen levels too, just like you did in the first game, and you're in for a damn good time. Isaac wears a new selection of spacesuits in this game that have a bit more color and variety to their designs. The environments you walk around in are much darker overall than the ones in the original Dead Space. At a few points, you need to aim where you want to see using a flashlight, which drastically reduces your field of view and makes fighting enemies a lot harder. Dead Space 2 is significantly more difficult than the first game. Even on the standard setting, leveling up all of my weapons and gear from scratch again, I felt the pushback more prominently. I think it has some form of adaptive difficulty at play. I died a lot more than I did in my playthrough of the first game. There was a lot more trial and error going on. I find the enemies to be more aggressive in Dead Space 2 as well. Countless times you will be flanked by necromorphs behind you that you didn't even realize were there. Dead Space 2 puts an emphasis on stomping enemies after you kill them to receive additional resources. Rewarding players for this behavior was a nice touch, because I feel many of us were stomping downed enemies anyways to ensure the fuckers were really dead. The stomp in Dead Space plays the same role as the knife in Resident Evil. During very few combat encounters, there will be a hull breach that happens, and you will need to hit a switch to turn on the airlock doors quickly before poor Isaac has his arms caught in it and torn off his body. Nasty. Weapon and rig upgrades work the same as they did in the previous game using collected power nodes. In Dead Space 2, you can spend 5,000 credits to respec all of them if you want to. In the original game, if you placed any nodes on weapons you stopped using, they were simply put to waste. But here, you have a lot more freedom modifying your preferred arsenal. I also love that some of the weapons have special abilities now too, like adding fire damage to their bullets for example. Speaking of weapons, there's a lot of fun ones to choose from in Dead Space 2. You've got returning weapons like the line gun, pulse rifle, flamethrower, force gun, ripper, contact beam, and of course, the plasma cutter, still the most effective and practical when fully upgraded. But you've got new ones like the detonator gun that places mine traps, the Seeker sniper rifle that has 2 levels of aiming, though most of the time, necromorphs are too close to really use it, and my favorite, the javelin gun. It has a slow firing rate, shooting out these metal rods to impale enemies. It's not always the best choice in battle, especially against the faster necromorph types, but its alternate fire is incredibly fun, discharging electricity out of the last rod fired, which can damage nearby enemies and even yourself if you're not careful. I love this weapon. It might be my favorite in the whole series. There's a greater variety of necromorphs in Dead Space 2, which makes the combat even more engaging than before. All the ones that were featured in the original game carry over into this one, but new ones include stalkers that are shorter and more intelligent than the rest of the necromorphs. They hunt their prey in groups, hiding behind objects before violently charging at you. The sections you face them in are like little battle arenas. I'm sure velociraptors were their primary inspiration. Did I mention they let out these blood-curdling screams? The bodies of the pukers are fucking disgusting. Digestive acid has eaten away at their flesh, and they spew it at you out of their mouths from a distance. The pack are a group of small pale necromorphs, transformed children, that dart towards you in swarms. They go down with single shots, but it's the sheer number of them that spawn that can overwhelm you. Crawlers are reanimated infants that explode when they get near you, or when the yellow sacs growing out of their backs are destroyed. They're introduced during this creepy daycare elementary school sequence early in the game within the Titan Heights residential complex. More on that later. Tripods are larger necromorphs, more slender than the brutes, with long arms and tongues. You damage them by shooting the yellow clusters growing from their elbows or on their tongue. Cysts are stationary growths scattered along walls, ceilings, and floors that release exploding pods if they sense that you are near. You can slowly navigate yourself around them, but I usually just plug them full of a couple bullets to get them out of the way. They make these weird sounds, and in low visibility areas, it can be a pain in the ass finding every last one. And finally, there are nests, a grouping of large tentacles with multiple yellowish-orange sacs that fire homing tentacle projectiles at you. They can only survive in zero-gravity environments, which are the only places you encounter them. So on to the story. Dead Space 2 takes place 3 years after the events of the first game, in the year 2511. Following the disastrous outbreak of necromorphs within the mining colony on Aegis 7, which spread into and killed everyone aboard the USG Ishimura, the united governing body of the Earth, the Governing Colonial Alliance, or EarthGov for short, has managed to contain it. However, a member of EarthGov, the Director of Operations in charge of the Titan space station Sprawl, named Hans Tiedemann, has been conducting more marker experiments there. EarthGov has been trying to figure out a way to control the power of the markers and harness their energy, because of course they are. Since the Ishimura, Isaac has been experiencing violent hallucinations induced by his exposure to the red marker, most of which center around his dead girlfriend Nicole, who had taken her own life on the Ishimura to prevent herself from turning into a necromorph. Isaac has been imprisoned in an insane asylum on Sprawl, and Tiedemann and his scientists have been using special drugs to prevent his mind from collapsing in on itself. They have kept it intact so they can extract useful data from it to create other markers. You see, when Isaac interacted with the red marker in the first game, it had imprinted alien codes and blueprints into his mind that can be used to recreate other markers. A necromorph outbreak would occur on Sprawl, and Isaac would be freed from the mental hospital by a hacker named Franco Delisle. The asylum had been overrun, though, and Delisle is immediately killed and turned into a necromorph. His face disgustingly breaks apart and reminds me of some of those toys of Psycho from Max Steel, if anyone remembers those, or that show in general, for that matter. Not that the rest of the game isn't good, but I think a lot of us would agree that the initial chapters of Dead Space 2 are some of the best sequences in the entire series. When you make your way through the space station, the various tenement buildings where all the innocent civilians are being attacked, ripped apart, and transformed into necromorphs, it's some of the most haunting stuff I've ever experienced playing a horror game. At first, overwhelming levels of screaming can be heard, filling the air, but as you progress, these screams, the evidence of human life, become quieter and quieter. In a laundromat, you come across what sounds like a child trapped inside of a washing machine, yelling for help. They were probably shoved in there as a last-ditch effort by their parents to save their life from the necromorphs. You can't do anything to remove them. Why even try? If you did, they would surely die. You just have to push onwards and try to ignore it. Later, in an elementary school and daycare, you also see a parent, or possibly a member of the daycare staff, go to hug one of the babies they recognize, only to be blown to bits like a pizza pocket exploding in a microwave. Walking through all these places, once happy and brimming with life and energy, now utterly ravaged by this necromorph outbreak, it's very chilling. You feel powerless. You know nothing can be done to stop it. All that matters is your own survival. You have to look after yourself first and foremost. That's the scary reality of the situation. The other strong moments from the first few hours of the game happen within Sprawl's Church of Unitology you enter. Seeing one of the places where all of this marker worship originates is disturbing. The amount of resources that have been pumped into this propaganda factory. It's all manipulation. I like how this section explores more of the backstory of Unitology though. That the church had been started following the death of a geophysicist named Michael Altman, who had studied the original marker and was the one who first revealed its existence to mankind. He died, and Unitologists believe his death was some government conspiracy hiding the truth of the marker from humanity. The idea that Unitology is highly influential with a lot of big corporations in its pocket, not to mention its spiritual and extraterrestrial aspects. Visceral was clearly taking jabs at Scientology and their unorthodox beliefs with Dead Space 2. There are also direct similarities that can be made between Unitology and cults like Heaven's Gate, for example, with their end goal being some form of mass sacrifice, in this case an event called convergence, misguided fools. The Church of Unitology finds itself at odds with the Earth government. They both want markers, but for different reasons. One scientific, as a means of harnessing infinite energy, and the other religious, the spiritual transcendence they believe they'll experience after death, with only a select few knowing of the unholy necromorph transformation that goes along with it. EarthGov and the Church of Unitology are at war and sabotage one another's goals. Isaac is caught in the middle. His escape from the asylum on Sprawl is aided by a woman named Dana Le Guin, who claims that she can help him cure his dementia. But you soon discover that Dana is a unitologist sent by the church to capture Isaac, so they can use the data in his mind to create their own series of markers. Dana would be inadvertently killed in an ambush by the EarthGov, intended to kill Isaac. Now that they have the information they need from him, he no longer serves a purpose, and they want him eliminated. They also want to ensure the valuable data in his mind cannot be harvested by the unitologists as well. It's all about maintaining the advantage, having more knowledge and power than someone else. You know how it is. Humanity in a nutshell. In Sprawl's colorful commercial district, Isaac encounters a survivor, a pilot named Ellie Langford, who locks herself behind a security gate and takes out a bunch of necromorphs chasing her. Isaac proposes a team-up, but Ellie is reluctant to do so, believing any partnership would be a liability. The two would slowly learn to trust one another as the story continues. Ellie, at least in Dead Space 2, is my favorite side character in the series. She's very likable, a tough-as-nails female survivor in the same vein as Ripley from Alien. Ellie would eventually encounter a former EarthGov scientist named Nolan Strauss, another patient that had escaped the mental hospital along with Isaac. He had been tasked with studying fragments of the red marker destroyed in the first game, and exposure to it made him go mad, but he seems to know how to access the data stored in Isaac's mind and destroy the new marker that was made from it. Isaac wants Ellie to guard Strauss and keep him alive, but his mental state deteriorates, and whenever you are separated from the two, Strauss attacks Ellie, even bites her at one point. With her life in constant danger, it takes a lot of coaxing from Isaac to calm her down, and not have her just kill him and be done with it. Strauss ends up gouging out Ellie's right eye with a screwdriver. I remember when this happened the first time I played this game. I was not at all shocked or surprised. This man's insane behavior was getting worse and worse. Isaac was being extremely illogical, allowing him to travel with them. I grew angry at Isaac a little bit. Isaac had little regard for Ellie's safety, and it felt like he was even using her at times, just to protect what was clearly a lost cause. I don't even think they get a whole lot of useful information out of Strauss that they couldn't have somehow figured out on their own, and even when they do get what they need, they put up with his murderous tendencies for far too long. They were asking for something bad to happen. It's kind of frustrating to see it all transpire, and if you ask me, I think it's the weakest element of Dead Space 2's story, how inept Strauss makes the main characters appear for a while. Strauss would attack Isaac with the screwdriver he used on Ellie, and Isaac is forced to kill him in self-defense. If you had any sympathy for Strauss, there was none left by that point. It was like putting a sick dog out of its misery. He was an ongoing problem. It sucks what happened to his mental health, but his actions were inexcusable. I'm sorry. The USG Ishimura had been drifting aimlessly in space, and sometime between the events of the first game and this one, the once great mining ship would be docked at the Sprawl space station to be cleansed of necromorphs and hopefully repaired by EarthGov. On their way to the government sector to find Tiedemann and the new marker, the tram the heroes are riding on is forcefully stopped by Tiedemann, who is in control of the station's solar array. Isaac is then forced to re-enter the Ishimura in Chapter 10 to activate the ship's gravity tethers to help pull themselves the rest of the way. Chapter 10 is another one of the high points of Dead Space 2. Getting to re-explore the Ishimura in a completely different way is captivating. It's been locked down under quarantine. The various equipment strewn about and wall patches taped up look to be as effective as small bandages being placed on a gaping infected wound. This section of the story plays with your expectations. There are many callbacks to the original game, moments where you think enemies will pop out at you, but they don't. You don't encounter necromorphs until you get pretty far into the ship. The game builds up the anticipation. You keep asking yourself where they're hiding, if there are even any there at all. What we've got here is a case of workers clocking out before the job was done, and by clocking out, I mean they were torn to shreds and transformed into undead alien monstrosities. My favorite parts of the Ishimura are the ones lit with ultraviolet light, letting you see the splashes and smears of blood littering the walls and floors. Throughout Isaac's walk through the ship, his PTSD takes hold, and he experiences even more intense hallucinations. His visions of Nicole are far more violent in this game than they were in the first, with her attacking you and threatening to kill you. Her manifestation is the result of the marker's continued influence on Isaac, but it's also anchored deeply within the guilt he feels surrounding her death. Nicole was his everything. He tells her that without her, he has nothing. Deep in the heart of the Ishimura, you enter the chamber where the hunter necromorph was once released, and the terrifying realization that you haven't fought one or any variation of one in this game yet sinks in. Oh fuck. Isaac and Ellie would reach the government sector of Sprawl, breaking into it with the help of a giant mining drill they come across. You have to fight a shit ton of necromorphs on top of that thing. They're lured to it because of all the noise. Isaac becomes cornered by a bunch of EarthGov soldiers, but it's hilarious when you turn the power off, breaching security, allowing a bunch of necromorphs to charge in and slaughter the attack dogs sent after you by Tiedemann, and then walking through the horrific byproduct afterwards. Isaac would end up tricking Ellie to board a shuttle and send her off Titan. This upsets her, but Isaac explains that he can't lose Ellie like he lost Nicole. He doesn't want to fail another, someone else he has developed strong feelings for. In the government sector, it's neat how you get to see numerous reproduced markers in various stages of synthesization, either housed in large multicolored vats or encircled with lasers. One of them has you slowing down the laser arms with stasis to get past, all while battling necromorphs that crawl under it. Isaac eventually reaches the large Site-12 marker the blueprints in his mind helped create. This thing is massive. Tiedemann, who had retreated to the base of the marker, contacts Isaac through his rig link and tells him that EarthGov's research is necessary. They are close to finding a way to control the marker's power. Sure they are. Suddenly, due to the large mass of necromorphs gathered around the marker, a convergence event takes place. The marker flashes brightly, emits loud noises and strong bursts of energy, and the necromorphs are hurled into the air with a powerful upward thrust of wind, beginning to be consumed into a single biomass. What that biomass actually is will be explained further in my review of Dead Space 3, so stay tuned. Isaac would be drawn to a special diagnostic machine by his visions of Nicole. The machine is able to stimulate the marker data in his brain, unlocking the part of it where it is stored. It does this by jabbing a large needle directly into the patient's ocular cavity so their entire skull doesn't need to be opened up like a can of tomato sauce. This MRI-like machine is one of the more memorable sequences in this entire game because you control the speed in which the needle is lowered towards Isaac's eye. It's absolutely stomach-churning, and the unsettling visual sticks with you. The faster you move the needle arm, the higher Isaac's heart rate rises, and the more erratic his eye movement becomes. I thought I was going to fail this numerous times, but I was impressed with myself. After over 10 years since I've played this game, not remembering the best strategy to beat it, I still succeeded on my very first try, but that also meant I didn't get to see or capture the animation of it killing Isaac. What a shame. After you use the diagnostic machine, you'll find that the door you're supposed to go through is locked. You hear a necromorph smash through the far wall of the room, and lo and behold, it's Mr. Regeneration Face making his appearance at last. The regenerating necromorph in Dead Space 2 isn't called a hunter. No, this one is souped up on steroids, and goes by the name of an ubermorph. It's more gray in color, and has 5 glowing red eyes. Throughout the last 2 chapters of the game, you are forced to battle it. Same as before, you need to dismember the limbs and then stasis the body to slow the regeneration process down. Things are a bit trickier than in the original game though. You need to make sure you're stocked up on lots of ammo and healing items for this one. There's a lot more multitasking going on, with you fighting a variety of other necromorphs alongside the ubermorph. It follows you through doors and elevators. It doesn't let up. You need to solve a hacking puzzle and carry a high-ranking officer to open a door with its scanner. All of this with an unstoppable and unrelenting necromorph right up your ass. Just when you think it's gone, it finds a way to come back. It's extremely nerve-wracking. Isaac reaches Tiedemann, who has become badly burned due to the energy of the convergence. In his weakened state, he tries to kill Isaac with a javelin gun, but Isaac is able to counter him and shoot him in the back of the head instead. The marker has been using hallucinations of Nicole to bring Isaac to it so it can merge with its creator. The final boss of Dead Space 2 isn't as traditional as the hive mind was at the end of the first game. The fight happens inside the confines of Isaac's mind, against the ghost of Nicole. She constantly walks and even teleports towards you. You have to make sure she doesn't make contact, or it results in an instant death. You shoot a bunch of shadowy figures that are shaped like pack necromorphs, and then shoot Nicole enough to expose the part of Isaac's brain where the red marker still has influence over him. You repeat this process until it's destroyed completely, and in turn it kills and deactivates the Site-12 marker. At the end, Ellie returns to save Isaac, and the reactor core of the Titan station explodes, wiping out everyone and everything that was on it, including that kid stuck in the washing machine from earlier. Thought I'd let you forget about that, huh? While Isaac's mind may still contain information about the markers, the hold they have on him has been wiped clean. With Ellie by his side, Isaac's future seems clearer, brighter. There's a callback to the jump scare at the end of the first game, but this time, thankfully, nothing happens. A sigh of relief. Like I said at the start, Dead Space 2 is my favorite game in the series. While I still believe the original remains the scariest and is filled to the brim with greater atmosphere pound for pound, Dead Space 2 is more fun to play, with the strong additions it makes to the gameplay, injecting a lot more variety with its navigation, puzzle solving, and even a bit of its combat. It does focus more on the action, but still contains some genuinely frightening sequences and jump scares. It finds the happy medium between horror and action, and effectively utilizes both genres simultaneously. The third and final Dead Space game I'll be looking at in my Dead Space retrospective this year is of course Dead Space 3. With this one, a lot of bizarre choices were made with it. I remember it being a bit of a disappointment when it came out back in 2013. I found it to be the weakest in the Dead Space series, no questions asked. But unlike Dead Space 1 and 2, that I have played and beaten numerous times, Dead Space 3 is the outlier. I beat it when it first came out, and then haven't touched it since. I've thrown it aside, forgot it even existed in a lot of ways, and my negative thoughts on it may have risen to the surface over the years, with the positive aspects of the game, the redeeming qualities it does have, left ignored and lying dormant, frozen, beneath layers and layers of ice and snow. Dead Space 3 gets a bad rep. I don't think I'd be really hazarding a guess in saying that it's the least admired game in the series in the eyes of the fans. Its lukewarm critical reception and less than stellar commercial sales, at least compared to those of its predecessors, led to the cancellation of Dead Space 4 by publisher EA, which was kinda harsh, and was a contributing factor in the closure of Dead Space developer Visceral Games in 2017, even harsher. I myself have been guilty of being critical towards Dead Space 3. When it came out back in 2013, a few things it did soured me on the franchise. I was left mystified by some of the decisions made in it. It left a gaping hole of disappointment in my soul, which is the main reason I had not returned to it in all the years since. But following my recent playthrough and capture of the game in preparation for this retrospective video, I am happy to say that my feelings towards Dead Space 3 have greatly improved. I was too hard on it, misguided. While it still has flaws with it that I want to address, and yes, I do still believe it's the weakest of the trilogy as a complete package, there is a lot to praise as well. I think a lot of Dead Space 3 is misunderstood and misrepresented. Unlike Dead Space 1 and 2 that found ways to effectively balance their action and survival horror elements, more so the latter, as the original Dead Space remains the strongest from a purely survival horror standpoint, the scariest of the bunch, Dead Space 3 feels a lot more like your run-of-the-mill action game. Dramatic set pieces, explosions, and you never really feel like you're at a disadvantage playing it. You feel overpowered. It's less frightening and nail-biting atmospherically. Isaac Clarke is like Nathan Drake from Uncharted, with how invincible he feels against these seemingly insurmountable odds the game puts in front of you. The big addition Dead Space 3 makes to the tried and tested formula from past games, one I think was a bit controversial, is the introduction of a weapon customizer at crafting benches. In theory, it's a solid idea. Isaac is an engineer after all, and once you do get the hang of it, it is a lot of fun with the surplus of options and upgrades available to you. But I do think it could have been made more intuitive. You don't really feel like you're taking full advantage of this system until later parts of the game, when you have enough found resources to pump into it. EA being EA, Dead Space 3 incentivized microtransactions to get more resources fast. During the later parts of this game, when you have enough resources in your inventory, it's not an issue, and you'll be creating some pretty sweet and badass hardware. But for the longest time, you'll feel like you're just scratching the surface with this system, and it can be a little frustrating, to be honest. The benches act as the one-stop shop to craft not only weapons and their upgrades, but ammunition and healing items too. Weapon upgrades don't use power nodes anymore, and instead, these square circuits you find that give you combinations of plus and minus effects. Ammo has become universal, which I think is one of the biggest issues with this crafting system. I know it's been simplified due to all of the other resources you collect now, but once you learn the stronger weapon types and ammo combinations, like the chain gun with acid rounds for example, you rarely find yourself switching weapons and using different strategies. Dead Space 3 doesn't really promote that kind of thing like past games did, that had distinct weapons and ammo to pick up. When you ran out of bullets with one weapon, you were forced to switch to another, one you may have been less comfortable using. You were prevented from relying on just one and coasting through the entire game. I know customizing weapons allows you to use two different types at the same time in Dead Space 3, but still, I don't think the player is as experimental as the developer wants them to be, not once you find a gun that works and devastates anything that crosses its path. What it comes down to is that Dead Space 3 is way too easy. With universal ammo and pooled resources to create weapons, upgrade them, and your rig, the challenge of inventory management is essentially gone in this game. I found myself with too many healing items in my playthrough. They're very inexpensive to craft, even the larger med packs. It doesn't help that on top of the resources you find yourself in the game world, and by defeating enemies, you get up to 3 scavenger bots that you can deploy to find even more resources and deposit them automatically at crafting benches. For so much of this stuff, you feel like you're on autopilot. You've got a constant safety net underneath you. I played on normal difficulty, but this is one you might want to start on harder difficulties instead. It's just not that challenging. The weapon crafting is the main change fundamentally Dead Space 3 implemented, but a few other quick things of note I wanted to bring up include the zero-gravity sections. They've been made far more expansive. You'll be flying around in these larger outer space environments. Because there is more distance to cover, oxygen can be replenished with floating air canisters that are highlighted. These zero-gravity sequences were some of my favorites in Dead Space 2, but unfortunately, in Dead Space 3, they disappear from the game from about the halfway point until close to the end. I think maybe their novelty had worn off. You walk around and shoot things most of the time in Dead Space 3. While you can still aim your gun to point your flashlight to light up darkened areas, the pattern of the visors on Isaac's suit helmets also light up the environments a little bit too, which is a cool lighting effect Visceral added. You still have the hacking minigame to open some doors, but now there's another that has you sliding nodes using the 2 analog sticks. They can't go through each other. A few times you will also have to flip switches on fuse boxes to match the amount of electricity required. This kind of thing we've seen in many other games before, but it's satisfying and fun nonetheless. Dead Space 3 shakes it up by having side missions on top of the main story objectives. Throughout the game, you uncover these optional missions and can set them as your primary goal under the Missions tab. I recommend you do as many of them as you can, not only to find more upgrades and resources for your crafting, but also to expand upon the rich lore found in these games. A few of the side narratives surrounding the survivors, or what's left of them, are as fascinating as they are unsettling. The side missions do add quite a bit of needless length to the game though. Dead Space 1 had 12 chapters, Dead Space 2 had 15, and Dead Space 3 has 19, minus the 7 side missions made available to you throughout. Dead Space 3 does get a bit tiring in areas. Not all of the side missions are that compelling. One major complaint I do have regarding them is that despite your goals varying from mission to mission, a few of them seem to reuse similar bunker environments, as if the developers just copy and pasted assets. Some of these missions don't feel as unique as they could have been appearance-wise, which can make them feel really boring, all too familiar once you've beaten several. There are 3 additional side missions you come across that can only be played in co-op. Yes, another thing Dead Space 3 implemented was cooperative online play. At any point, you could pause the game and invite a friend to join a session, playing as the game's secondary antagonist, Sergeant John Carver of the Earth Defense Force. Playing online multiplayer would adjust some of the game's puzzles, and apparently have each player experience unique dementia-induced hallucinations. I've never played the co-op version of the campaign before because I don't like playing online. I didn't know anyone else who owned Dead Space 3 at the time of its release either, not to mention enjoyed it enough to invest more time in it to play with me. When you play the solo campaign, John Carver will pop up a few times within cutscenes to give the illusion that he's in your vicinity, that he and Isaac have split up, performing their own tasks, and then regroup with each other at certain points. It can be kind of distracting. John Carver isn't all that interesting as a character either, at least not when compared to Isaac. His family had been killed in a necromorph outbreak. He has a chip on his shoulder as a result, some survivor's guilt. It's the kind of backstory we've heard a million times. He starts out a total piece of shit, not wanting anything to do with you, but slowly grows on you a little by the game's end. He becomes a loyal brother in arms. Story-wise, I think Dead Space 3 does most of the heavy lifting in this series, explaining a lot of the ideas introduced in the first two games, and bringing many of their concepts full circle. While the last half of the game is hard to put down, the earlier chapters are extremely disengaging for a variety of reasons, the weakest parts of any of these Dead Space games in my opinion. I think the drastic changes the game makes to its mechanics doesn't help. The player is overwhelmed by a lot of it. I didn't even mention yet that Dead Space 3 implements a cover system. I think it's sloppily executed and doesn't fit this kind of game whatsoever. I hate cookie-cutter military shooters, and having this kind of thing in Dead Space, shooting up human enemies instead of monsters, tarnishes the uniqueness of what made these games so special in the first place. The prologue of the game is set 200 years before the events of the rest of it. You don't play as Isaac, and instead, Private Tim Kaufman of the Sovereign Colonies, the precursor of what would become the EarthGov Colonial Alliance. On the remote frozen planet of Tau Volantis, Private Kaufman is sent to locate a mysterious object called the Codex by the head of the colony's science division, Dr. Earl Serrano. In this prologue, you are attacked by one of the few new enemy types in Dead Space 3, Wasters. They look like early-stage necromorphs. They take on the physical characteristics of their hosts in an attempt to trick or confuse their prey. They give me Thing from Another World vibes. Rather than use their sharp limbs to attack you, Wasters implement various melee weapons, such as axes, crowbars, and pipe wrenches. They transform as you battle them too. If you destroy their upper bodies, their legs will walk around with flailing tentacles in their place. If you destroy their legs, their torso will grow tentacles that shoot projectiles at you like the Lurkers do. They function like the Wavo from Resident Evil 6 that came out the year prior, only that game had a lot more variations to their transformations, depending on where you damaged them. Private Kaufman would obtain the Codex on a crashed starship, the Mule, and reach an encampment to find his fellow soldiers dead, hanging on electrical wires. Kaufman would be startled by his commanding officer, General Spencer Mahad. Kaufman would explain that if he gets the Codex to the city, he could save them all. The general tells Kaufman that things have gotten out of control with their expedition. The general would suddenly turn on Kaufman and shoot him point blank in the face before saluting the flag of the Sovereign Colonial Armed Forces and taking his own life. Now, you don't know the circumstances behind what is going on at first. That comes later on, and through several text logs you find. But basically, General Mahad thought he was helping stop a necromorph infestation by killing all of his men on the planet so they couldn't leave and spread the message of the marker. But, as we will soon learn, preventing Private Kaufman from reaching the so-called city, he inadvertently doomed all of humanity. We cut to the present, a few years after Dead Space 2, in the year 2514. Isaac and Ellie had begun a relationship and tried to settle down, hiding out from EarthGov in the grungy New Horizons lunar colony on Earth's moon. At some point, Ellie had broken up with Isaac because he kept running from his past. She wanted to continue pursuing the markers and put a stop to them, whereas Isaac just wanted to be left alone. I think Ellie's behavior here is very cruel, considering the fact that Isaac has done most of the work fighting monsters up till now, and essentially had his brain fucked by an alien artifact. If Ellie had been experiencing any dementia-induced hallucinations, we aren't made aware of them as the player. It's as if she's been immune to them all this time. I call bullshit there. Honestly, I don't like what was done with Ellie in Dead Space 3. She went from being one of my favorite supporting characters to one of my least favorite. She pulls a complete 180 from what she was at the end of Dead Space 2, someone Isaac could lean on with his trauma, to someone who straight up abandoned him for it. Throughout Dead Space 3, it's clear that she still has feelings for Isaac. By the end, Ellie straight up says she loves him again. Her character doesn't grow in any significant way, even after the death of, well, we'll get to that in a bit, but nothing about this story in regards to her and her relationship with Isaac feels paramount. It's moving backwards, not forwards. It's a complete waste of time, in my opinion, contrived in every sense of the word. Anyways, Isaac would be forcibly approached in his apartment by two EarthGov soldiers, the aforementioned John Carver, accompanied by Officer Robert Norton. They tell him that Ellie needs his help on a new mission involving the Markers. Her last point of contact was near the planet of Tau Volantis. Reluctantly, he agrees, and meets up with her and her team, consisting of engineer Jennifer Santos and old-timey veteran Austin Buckle, on an abandoned military platform orbiting the Tau Volantis system, called the CMS Roanoke. Ellie's eye, that she lost during the events of Dead Space 2, has been replaced with an artificial one, and we come to learn that Norton is Ellie's new boyfriend. Lovely. The two have zero chemistry together, and a lot of this story focuses on the love triangle between Isaac, Ellie, and Norton. Norton is a complete douchebag, and Isaac and Norton are at each other's throats countless times due to their bitter jealousy towards the other. It's like they're back in high school. I get that people can become stubborn, desperate, and irrational during survival situations like this, but it still doesn't make it fun to sit through in a video game. This kind of shit should be the last thing on everyone's minds. It just pulls all three characters down, having all this unnecessary baggage attached to them. Isaac would help Ellie decipher strange marker inscriptions found on the walls of the Admiral's quarters on the Roanoke. They speak of a key, a machine, and the words "turn it off" written over and over again. Isaac and Ellie believe that Tau Volantis may be the homeworld of the Markers. If they can locate the key and use it to turn off the machine, they could end this necromorph nightmare for good. Up until now, both Norton and Carver, more so the former, would talk down to Isaac and order him around like a dog, despite Isaac having far more experience than either man in combat against the necromorphs. When Isaac and Ellie formulate a plan to go down to Tau Volantis, Norton strongly opposes it, feeling outnumbered by the rest of the team and concerned that Ellie may still have feelings for Isaac. This only makes him more hostile towards Isaac. The crew would search an old Sovereign Colony ship, the CMS Terra Nova, drifting nearby, for a functioning shuttle to take down to the planet's surface. In the Terra Nova's cargo bay, you encounter the first regenerating hunter in this game, and shortly afterwards are chased by yet another, having to fight two off simultaneously while waiting for a tram to arrive at the station. Having a battle of this magnitude happen in Chapter 5 this early in the game, when you're still getting your bearings with the new crafting mechanics, is actually quite challenging. It led to my first death. Hunters can be big meanies. When you make it to the shuttle bay in Chapter 6, and Ellie accidentally initiates the launch procedure, you have to deal with the hunters again, moving quickly through catwalks as walls of flame shoot out all around you to block your path and slow your progress. Afterwards, the hunter enemy type does not return for the remainder of the story, which is kind of upsetting. I think there are 3 you fight at the same time later in the game on Tau Volantis, but it's exclusive to one of the co-op side missions, I believe. I wouldn't know. I've never played them.
Oh, shit! This one's regenerating!
How are you going to kill it?
I'm not!
As Isaac, you get to steer the Terra Nova shuttle through the atmosphere of Tau Volantis, dodging debris and space mines, but you're an engineer and not a pilot. The ship gets knocked off course, breaks apart, and crashes, separating the team. I mentioned that the beginning chapters of Dead Space 3 are a bit disengaging, but once you land on Tau Volantis, the story picks up a great deal. The snowy planet is my second favorite location from the series, under the Ishimura from the first game. I just find it to be so unique, so different from what had come before. I think it's one of the best snowy environments ever put in a video game, in all honesty. I can count on one hand the ones that truly stand out to me, and Tau Volantis is one of them. You really get a sense of the harshness of the cold. Until you find an insulated snowsuit, Isaac is freezing to death. A whole new countdown meter is present on his rig that shows his body temperature. You have to walk close to fires, the burning remains of the crashed shuttle, or activate generators inside of buildings to heat him back up. There's low visibility in every direction, and veering off the beaten path for too long to try and find some extra goodies could lead to your demise. Once you acquire a snowsuit, I love how the snow builds up on it the longer you are outside. Visceral puts so much care and attention into the mechanics and visuals here. I just wish more of Dead Space 3 took place on Tau Volantis. It takes a bit too long for you to get here. Necromorphs will frequently jump out of the snow to attack you. In some of the lodging areas you explore, you come across thin necromorphs called feeders that have heightened senses and respond to sound and bright lights. They are the result of humans resorting to eating necromorph-infected flesh to survive, and would become infected themselves. Clearly they're inspired by the legend of the Wendigo. Creepy stuff. On your way to get a snowsuit, you find Buckle, who dies of wounds and hypothermia. Isaac manages to regroup with the rest of the team who had survived the crash. They come across a giant, frozen necromorph hive mind in a warehouse, and Isaac uses a special device to activate nerve clusters inside its body so they can track down the marker's signal. Afterwards, Norton chooses to not release you from the cage that lowered you inside of it. He wants to ensure Ellie survives this suicide mission. I never understood this. Did Norton not think Isaac could use stasis to simply pull the lever and open the cage? Isaac has been using stasis this whole time. What a dipshit. Activating the nerve clusters also reawakens the hive mind, and you have a boss battle with it reminiscent of the one at the end of the original Dead Space. Once you kill it, Norton double-crosses you, blaming Isaac for the entire situation and attempts to shoot him. Isaac, in self-defense, is forced to put a bullet in him instead. I decided to drop his corpse off the cliffside. Goodbye, fuckface. Ellie isn't gonna be happy, though. At first, hearing the news of Norton's actions, Ellie doesn't take it too well and stops communicating with Isaac, furious at him. But it doesn't last that long, quite frankly, like 20 minutes or so. She gets over the death of her new boyfriend as if it were just a minor inconvenience, before showing more affection to Isaac again. It's all very poorly written and paced, and once again damages Ellie's character coming off of Dead Space 2. Santos would be killed on a lift by a large creature known only as the Snow Beast that you encounter multiple times on the planet. Her death is actually quite impactful because trying to hold the elevator up endangers the rest of the team, as the added weight of the monster is causing the mountainside to collapse. Carver is the one to cut the cable, saving the rest of their lives, but Isaac becomes angry, in denial over her death, and feeling there was something he could have done to prevent it, when in reality there wasn't. The surviving heroes would learn of a device known as the Codex, as well as a guide for it, a creature codenamed Rosetta. You locate its various pieces, one of which involves you solving this frustrating turn puzzle that has 2 of the 3 sections attached to each switch that move different degrees. I hate it. Once you find all of the pieces of Rosetta, you move them all with stasis into the proper order, matching all the cuts made when the Sovereign Colony's scientists dissected it. Turns out, Rosetta is actually an ancient extraterrestrial native to Tau Volantis. Much like many other worlds, their ocean planet was overrun with the necromorph virus, and in desperation, the aliens built a large machine to send it into an instant ice age, to stop the convergence event that was happening due to the black marker discovered there. Dead Space 3 further explains what convergence truly is, the final step in the necromorph life cycle. All of the necromorph tissue that gets hurled into the air during convergence is combined with the remnants of the infected planet to form one large, highly intelligent biomass called a Brethren Moon. They are the source of the marker signals. They form black markers inside themselves that they can disperse to new planets. Their ultimate goal is to replicate themselves and consume all organic life in the universe. It's time now that I discuss the human antagonist of this game, Jacob Arthur Danik, a high-ranking member of the Church of Unitology who leads a splinter terrorist group within it called the Inner Circle. I think Danik is the best human villain in the series. He feels the most fleshed out as a character, and his motivations, while deranged beyond belief, are interesting. The Circle wants to free all the markers from EarthGov's control, so that all of humanity can experience their glorious death and spiritual rebirth. His terrorists destroy several marker testing labs on New Horizons at the beginning, which allows their signals to be released and a necromorph infestation to run rampant. Danik and his soldiers follow you to Tau Volantis. They view Isaac Clarke as a marker killer and do everything in their power to obtain the Codex key so that they can deactivate the machine and reawaken the Blood Moon to initiate convergence. Danik is a wicked villain, my favorite of the human ones in the Dead Space games, but I do still find him to be very cliché and incompetently written. Numerous times he will threaten you over comms, telling you that he will not hesitate to shoot you the next chance he gets, only to do the opposite when the time comes. He's extremely devout to his religious beliefs, belief in the process of the convergence, what he thinks is going to happen during it, but like all of these religious wackos, he's misguided and a massive hypocrite. When the truth behind the Brethren Moons are revealed, he asks Isaac how he could possibly know what they are and what their true intent really is. That's calling the kettle black, isn't it? How the fuck does he know everything he is spewing is truth? He has no fucking idea, and the audacity to claim that he does. Once you get a hold of the Codex, which, by the way, was actually created by the marker-brainwashed sovereign colonies to turn off the alien machine using research done on Rosetta, you guessed it, Danik and his men take it away from you. They flood the lab containing Rosetta with a deadly gas, and with no way out, Ellie tearfully tells Isaac to close the door so he and Carver can escape. She also tells Isaac she loves him. Remember Norton? Me neither. Enraged by the death of Ellie, Isaac and Carver go after Danik and the rest of his circle, mowing down as many as they can and stealing back the Codex. They reach the machine, which is the size of a city. The characters even believe it to be one at first. Navigating your way through the machine is captivating, because you get to use a lot of visually interesting technology, opening doors with different ancient symbols, and learn a bit more about the aliens and the purpose of this underground, at one point underwater, structure. It was their last defense against the necromorph plague that was destroying their home. The machine acted as a protective seal against evil that had now become tampered with by the most pig-headed and selfish creatures in the universe, humans. Ellie's death felt so rushed and contrived in this story, but what I find even more contrived is the revelation that Ellie managed to survive the poison decontamination gas crawling through ventilation ducts. I highly doubt that was possible given the timeline of events. The Inner Circle would capture Ellie, and Danik uses her as leverage to get the Codex back from Isaac and Carver in the heart of the machine. He uses it to deactivate the alien device and resume the convergence event. Danik is immediately impaled and crushed by falling debris. I guarantee his spirit went nowhere. The incomplete necromorph moon, originally believed to just be the planet's regular moon, awakens and begins to consume all organic matter on Tau Volantis to grow larger and stronger. Isaac kisses Ellie goodbye and has her board Danik's shuttle to safety. He and Carver would make their way up to the Brethren moon and fight it. The boss battle is okay, feels more like set dressing than anything else. You just kill a few necromorphs that spawn and throw floating markers into the creature's multiple eyes with your stasis. There isn't a whole lot to it given the scale of everything. The moon feels like a pushover and doesn't really do a whole lot to attack you personally. A few tentacles that pop up that you have to shoot, that's all. Nothing too crazy. Isaac and Carver manage to reactivate the machine with the Codex, which kills the Blood Moon and sends it crashing into Tau Volantis. Carver gets sucked into the air, and we see Isaac falling to his death, looking at a picture of Ellie one last time before accepting his inevitable fate. Ellie has remained in orbit in Danik's shuttle, and is emotional when she realizes Isaac is gone. The marker signal can no longer be detected, and she sets off for Earth's coordinates. And that's where the story ends. After the credits roll, however, Isaac's voice is heard over the comms though, meaning he is alive. Too bad we never got a Dead Space 4. Maybe someday. What we did get to further the events of Dead Space 3 was a DLC story expansion entitled Awakened, which I want to quickly go over here. Reception for this DLC was mixed upon release. There was criticism targeted at its short length, and reuse of assets and locations from the base game, like Tau Volantis and the Terra Nova ship, and yeah, I agree, it's kind of lazily put together. The biggest issue I have with it is how it ends this trilogy on an even more confusing and dour cliffhanger than the base game did. We really needed Dead Space 4 to tie up some of these loose ends. Isaac and Carver wake up on Tau Volantis, somehow having survived the battle with and subsequent destruction of the necromorph moon. They believe they are dead, possibly in some sort of purgatory. They encounter more necromorphs and experience more hallucinations, and Isaac is befuddled. He doesn't know how the infections are able to continue without the blood moon, without the marker signal. Awakened does implement horror a lot more than the base game did. There are quite a few effective jump scares and downright unsettling imagery sprinkled throughout. I think a lot of the reviews exaggerated how scary it is though. I don't think it's much worse than the main game is, in all honesty. A tad, but not much. And it still pales in comparison to the original Dead Space in sheer volume of frights. The ones in Awakened feel a bit more forced, put in there to rectify the lack of them in the base game. There are some interesting ideas presented in Awakened, and I still recommend it to anyone who enjoys the Dead Space series and its lore. After Isaac and Carver downed the necromorph moon, the remaining unitologists on the planet felt their previously undying faith leave them. Another cult was then formed, ones who believe their bodies to be imperfect, which is why they were rejected during the Convergence event. Their leader would mutilate them, cutting off their hands or cutting out their eyes as offerings to their god. Members that die are even propped up and made to look like necromorphs since they were denied the real transformation. These unitologists have gone fucking bonkers, which is saying a lot given the insane beliefs they had before. The Awakened DLC is when we learn officially that there is more than one Brethren moon, and that they are all interconnected with a single intelligent hive mind. Carver wants to leave for Earth and warn the rest of humanity, but visions Isaac has been experiencing hint that the moons may be using them to locate Earth so they can destroy it. Isaac wants to sabotage their means of transport, and Carver just wants to go home. They turn against each other temporarily, falling into madness and dementia just like everyone else. But the moons reveal to Isaac that they have accessed his mind and already know the location of Earth. They had been stalling the heroes, giving themselves enough time to get there. Isaac and Carver repair the Terra Nova and use it to return to the Earth, only to hear transmissions of a necromorph attack. They look out the cockpit window to see several Brethren moons, and one crashes into the ship. The screen goes black, and their true fates remain unknown. So after everything I've gone through in this video, how good is Dead Space 3? Does it hold up? What do I think of it? Well, it is the weakest of the Dead Space games for sure, though I enjoy the story elements involving the aliens on Tau Volantis, their machine, and the Necromorph moons. Both endings, the base one and the one found in the DLC, leave things on a cliffhanger that was unfortunately never followed through on. But even if a Dead Space 4 comes out, Dead Space 3's story is still paced pretty poorly in a few areas, and the writing can be mucky as well surrounding some of the characters. The gameplay changes were also really awkward. I hate the cover system. It doesn't suit this kind of game, and the weapon crafting makes combat and resource management a picnic. That said, my initial thoughts towards Dead Space 3 10 years ago were too harsh. I did have a lot of fun revisiting this game for this review. I wasn't bored like I was in my first playthrough of it, that I recall at least. I think time has made me more wise as a gamer, more attentive to the little things that I may have underappreciated in my youth. Dead Space 3 is far from being an outstanding game like its predecessors, but it's also not terrible either, like some people may have you believe, myself being one of them years ago. I like Dead Space 3. I have a soft spot for it now, and I think if they ever come out with a Dead Space 4 and follow through on some of the story points unanswered here, I'll even have a greater appreciation for it in the future. Dead Space 3 has a rightful place in this series. Go play it if you haven't before. That's gonna do it for my Dead Space retrospective this year. I hope you enjoyed it. Last year I looked at the Resident Evil games. This year the primary focus was on Dead Space, but moving forward, unless there are new releases in either of these franchises, I'm not going to be reviewing any more survival horror games in the month of October. I'm not going to make this a yearly tradition. There aren't any more franchises in this genre I want to talk about, at least at the moment. Don't worry, I will still be branching out with some more retrospective series in the coming year that aren't superhero and comic book related, but those will be dropping at random, not having anything to do with Halloween and the spookiness of the season, my favorite time of year. Stay tuned next week as I have a full lineup of Halloween-themed comic reviews coming out, the first official Halloween special I'll be doing since before the pandemic. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy lives to watch my content. If you'd like to show your support to me and my channel and ensure the production of future videos like this one, please do so by subscribing, hitting that bell icon for notifications, and by becoming a patron if you can. I will see you all next time. Take care and stay nerdy.